Invited me to his research lab in Edinburgh, and I was so eager to meet this man, but he was away, as he often is. But I had a great time even without him, hearing all of his colleagues and the other ideas and the like. Since then, we've been in many places together and had wonderful times together, and I'm so glad he's agreed to come here today to talk with you. He's the director for the Center for Infectious Disease Dynamics at Penn State. He previously, of course, was in Edinburgh until 2007, I believe, where he led a malaria research center. And I'm especially interested in his angles on things that are just slightly enough off the mainstream and provocative and creative enough to make you think for days about the possible dangers of vaccines, about possible alternative strategies for preventing antibiotic resistance, and whether or not the advice from well-meaning, supposedly evolutionary doctors about please take every pill in the bottle might in fact be the exact opposite of what a sophisticated evolutionary approach would suggest. We're so glad you're here, Andrew. Carry on.
Thanks very much, Randy. It's always disappointing to discover people have a great time when I'm not around. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk. It's a pleasure to be at ASU for my first time here. It's really amazing how much is going on and how big the place is and how much synergy is possible here with the new centre as well as existing expertise. In my group, we do quite a lot of different things. As Randy mentioned, we work on vaccine-driven evolution, we work on adaptation to new hosts, work on insecticide resistance in mosquitoes. And rather than go through a little bit of each of that, what I'm going to do is talk in detail about some of our work on drug resistance, most of which is in the context of malaria. But I became to appreciate that malaria is actually a great model system for working out proof of principle things in addition to any lessons that it may have for the actual situation of malaria in the field. So it's a miserable history, the history of drug failure in malaria. Chloroquine first went into widespread use at the end of the Second World War, and then the first fully drug-resistant parasites were seen in the field 10 years later. Progranul resistance, pyrimethamine resistance, and this is evolution in action that just leads to the failure of products. And so we have to abandon fantastically good, successful drugs. Artemisinin is the latest wonder drug. It's the last frontline drug that's approved for use. Works really well, but it's beginning to fail in Southeast Asia at the moment, and its days are numbered now. Now, there are new drugs in the pipeline, but they are, depending on who you talk to, 5 to 10 years away from approval for the field. So at the moment, we have artemisinin, and we've got the capacity to reformulate that, recombine it with different things. But there's no question that evolution happens, and the World Health Organization now appreciates that, and its policy to expect drugs to fail. It's built into the plans that these drugs are public goods that have transient, they're going to be good for us for temporary periods. And so the solution that we have at the moment to this is to continue to develop new drugs. So the plan is that for as long as malaria exists on the planet, we will continue to develop new drugs. So depending on your viewpoint, that might be just another 10 years or it might be forever. We've got to keep a pipeline of drug development going. And that's true for antimicrobials in general. This plan is that we will continue to discover new drugs. Now, that might work, right? It might be that we can find enough money to keep doing that and keep doing drug discovery, even though market forces do not favor this, even though the bugs themselves are getting smarter and smarter. So malaria parasites today are resistant to many different drugs, including drugs we haven't yet invented that would have worked once, because they've now evolved mechanisms of very general resistance. They can pump drugs out of their cells in a way they couldn't have done in the 1940s. So they've evolved very generalized resistance mechanisms, which are reducing all the time the number of candidate drugs. Now, it might be that there are new pathways being turned up in the genomics, and there's a lot of exciting stuff in principle. But you've got to ask yourself if this is going to be economically viable, if this is going to be able to be sustainable, what are we really going to do here? And to me, it's not enough just to start thinking about drug discovery. We have to start thinking about trying to slow down the rate at which this evolution happens, slow down the rate of failure of these drugs, and ideally stop it altogether. And that's what we call in my group evolution proofing, and that gets us into all sorts of trouble with evolutionary biologists. But evolution proofing, we mean here trying to slow down the rate at which evolution will undermine or erode away the efficacy of our therapeutics. And if we could do that really well, we'd stop it altogether, completely evolution-proof something. But even if we can't manage that, I think we should be trying at the outset to try to slow down the rate of evolution, at least give us some partial evolution proofing of our therapeutics. And if you want to slow down the rate of evolution, you've got two options. You can slow down the rate at which the genetic variation enters the system, the rate at which the raw material on which natural selection acts enters the situation. And the other possibility is then to fiddle with the strength of natural selection. So you can change the raw material, or you can change the strength. And that's it. There's no other options. The way I think about that is that we can, for example, with combination therapy, reduce the rate at which mutations come into the system for the cross-resistance. That's the thing that starts the spread of the alleles in the first place. And then we've got the natural selection, which is the thing that determines the fate of that mutation and how fast it then spreads through the population. So selection plays the game throughout. The mutational inputs is, if you like, the unbolting of the door for the horse to run out. Once the horse is running, it's the strength of selection that determines how fast it goes. HIV is one of our biggest evolutionary management successes. Combination therapy is the reason that HIV is no longer a death sentence, and that's because combination therapy reduces the rate at which, and at the moment to zero, the rate at which drug-resistant mutants enter the systems. And so that's a success story that was not discovered by evolutionary biologists, it was discovered by physicians doing it empirically. What I would like to suggest is that we need to start thinking as evolutionary biologists in partnership with physicians about ways that we can manage both the mutational inputs and the selection, strength of selection. And the good news here is that the strength of selection is determined entirely by humans. It's medicine that does it. It is us, it's in our hands, it's not anything magic, it's nothing weird, it's what we do, patients and physicians, is what's determining the rate at which resistance spreads through a population. So this is one of our study sites in India, where we are working on malaria. This is an area in northeast India which has got 3 or 4 month wet season where there's transmission in the order of Central Africa. In a place like this in India where they've got great frontline drug delivery, healthcare delivery, they really are working at resistance management. So they're actually doing evolutionary management in those villages in northeast India in a way that's in many ways better than what's going on in wealthy countries. So they make a big effort to reduce unnecessary drug use in the community, so they don't give drugs out unless you have malaria. They use drugs in combination, so this is one of the combination packs that's given out, and it's got, this particular one has artesunate, which is the artemisinin derivative, as well as SP, which is an old malarial drug. So they're giving the drugs out in combination. And then they're going to great efforts to ensure that the patients comply with treatment regimens. So this is a blister pack. You pop the pills out of the pack, so you can see that you've got 2 more days to go. And in these villages, they'll send out little kids, the nurse will send out kids to make sure that the patient has in fact taken the pill that day. So they really go to big efforts to make sure that the full drug course is taken. We sort of do something like that in the wealthy world. We do reduce unnecessary drug use at one level, so we make it impossible to buy antibiotics over the counter. On the other hand, the physician will give out antibiotics more or less willy-nilly if asked. This is an antibiotic I got probably for a viral infection a couple of years ago. So there is some attempt nationally and internationally to regulate the use of these drugs. We don't use them in combination. It's a very interesting question as to why community use of antibiotics is not combination therapy. We force people in the poorest countries in the world to take extra drugs to protect artemisinin for future generations, but we won't do the same thing in the Western world for our existing antimicrobials. Very interesting question as to why that is. And then we also got the blister packs and the enthusiasm to finish your drug course. And my question I want to deal with is this issue about why is it such a big deal to comply with treatment regimens? Where are the treatment regimens coming from? Are they really dealing with resistance management in the way that we hope? And I believe the whole idea about finishing drug courses comes from Fleming. This is his Nobel Prize speech, but he wrote about it in the New York Times a few years earlier. And I don't want to go through this too much, but he's talking here about how easy it is to get resistance. And he's saying that if you, Mr. X, buys some penicillin and gives himself not enough to kill the strep, but enough to educate them to resist penicillin, he then infects his wife. She gets pneumonia, isn't treated with penicillin. As the strep are now resistant, the treatment fails and Mrs. X dies. Who is responsible for Mrs. X's death? Why, Mr. X, whose negligent use of penicillin changed the nature of the microbe. moral if you use penicillin, use enough. And so Fleming's assertion of that in the 1940s, I think, is where we get our thinking from, that it's really important to hit these things with lots of drugs and hit them hard. And some of his wording here we get a bit tense about these days, and I would add that it's not just Mr. X's fault, it's also the physician, and there's a whole bunch of people involved in the drug treatment decision-making process. But nonetheless, that is generally the way we think about it these days, I think. This is how it looks in the malaria treatment guidelines that the World Health Organization publishes. So this is a book they publish for how to treat malaria, recommendations for physicians and for whole country policy. And early on in the document, they say resistance can be prevented or its onset considerably slowed by ensuring high cure rates through full adherence to correct dosing regimens. And the dosing regimens here are designed to get rid of all the pathogens as fast as possible. So if you have, for example, 10 to the 12 parasites in a person, you figure out how many of those parasites you can kill each day with a given drug, and you keep the concentration of that drug up for as many days as it takes to get rid of all of those 10 to the 12 parasites, so that 10 to the 12 goes to 0. And you do that as fast as possible. And the dosing regimens are set up in order to achieve that. Now, the thing I found very puzzling about that in the 1990s, it bothered me a lot, was that it's not obvious to me that hitting hard with the thing that's causing the resistance is the way to solve the problem. You know, the reason drug resistance doesn't spread in the absence of drug use. Drug resistance spreads in response to drug use. So it's kind of odd to hammer the infection hard with drugs in order to prevent resistance. It's just not obvious, if you're an evolutionary biologist, that follows. It might follow, you can imagine circumstances, but it's not obvious that it has to follow. The reason people say it's a good idea, and what Fleming was driving at, is that if you can hit hard with the drugs and kill the bugs, then there's no bugs around to mutate to resistance. Okay, so it's clear that dead things don't mutate, and so if you can kill them, you can stop that mutational input into the system. So that's why you should go after all the bugs and kill them all. And that's clearly an important factor. There's no question that if you can kill bugs, they're not going to cause you trouble. But the flip side of that is that when you hit them hard, you give maximum advantage to any of the resistant bugs that are already there. You clear out all of the bugs that are sensitive, you get rid of them as fast as possible, and you leave the world open to the resistant bugs. So that's what we think of in my group. We call it the double-edged sword of aggressive chemotherapy. If you go after all the bugs really aggressively with your drugs, you will stop mutational inputs into the system, but at the same time you will give maximum advantage to any that are already there. So just as by way of schematic, this is the parasite densities through time in a single patient, malaria parasites. And the idea is you get rid of all the bugs with the drugs, and that means all those other bugs that would have been there and could have mutated to resistance, they're now gone. So the mutational inputs into the system are reduced by that aggressive chemotherapy. But if there is a resistant bug there, it just takes over. So that's what we call the double-edged sword. There are two opposing forces that you generate when you hit your bugs with the drugs aggressively. You reduce the mutational inputs, but you increase the strength of selection and you give maximum advantage to any resistant bugs that are there. And that opposing force, that double-edged sword thing, I think is a really interesting problem in this area. And I'm going to spend the rest of the talk persuading you that there's no obvious solution to that and that it exists, that it's a very real problem in drug treatment. And so that means, if I am correct, that just going for the first part of this double-edged sword, the Fleming approach, is insufficient in modern medicine. Okay, so we work on parasites in mice, and I've had some great people in the lab, and these are the people that have done most of the work I'm going to talk about. This is one mouse that we have infected with, now let me see if I can make this happen. One mouse that we've infected with parasites on day 0, and the red line here is resistant parasites we put in, and the black line is sensitive parasites. We follow them with quantitative PCR through time. And we set this up at the beginning so that there's a lot of sensitive parasites and some resistant ones. And you can see that the resistant ones don't do nearly as well as the sensitive ones. And just to show you I'm not cherry-picking mice, here's 2 more. So the sensitive bugs, if we put them in a numerically dominant situation, stay numerically dominant, and the resistant ones are kept under control. If you drug treat, and so the grey bar here, maybe you can't see it, but we're drug treating around day 6 for 5 days, following the recommended guidelines. We're aggressively treating these parasites with, in this case, pyrimethamine, one of the old malarial drugs. And the sensitive bugs are killed out very rapidly by the drugs, and then the resistant ones go crazy. So they take over, like I was just saying, and they dominate the situation. So in the absence of drug use, the sensitive ones keep the resistant ones under control, use the drugs, and up you get bang, up they come the resistant ones. So if there are resistant ones there, the drug use does a really good job of making sure they dominate the situation. So that's the double-edged sword. We were, by getting rid of all these sensitive ones, stopping any of those mutating to resistance, but if the resistant ones are already there, they go crazy. Now, we've done a lot of those sort of experiments. I'm just going to show you one, which is my favorite. Well, for reasons that become obvious, I think. What we've done here is we put in, so this is now the number of parasites per mouse, and this is where we put in 1 million sensitive parasites, and then just before we're going to start drug treating, we put in a handful, I think in this case 20 resistant parasites. So 20 individual parasites into the whole infection. At that point, we have about 10 to the 9 parasites in the mouse as a whole, so 1 billion parasites, and we put in 20 resistant ones, and that's to mimic the chances or the de novo resistance of rising in situ. And each of these lines then is, and this is 7 mice, each of these lines then is the kinetics of the sensitive parasite infections through time, and the red one line here's the donors we put in, and we found by PCR in 2 mice at 2 separate times, we found some resistant parasites. Otherwise, we don't see them at all. So we put them in, but we just don't see them. And one of the nice things about malaria is you can study the transmission stage population. These are the parasites that end up going to mosquitoes, and those too are only sensitive parasites. So although we put the resistant ones in, none of them appeared in the transmission population. Now, if we drug treat, so here we are hammering away with the drugs from day 11, 12 onwards, very aggressive chemotherapy here for many days. Sensitive ones go down, and the resistant ones come up now. And you can see now the transmission population is dominated by resistant parasites. So by treating with 8 mg per kilogram for 7 days, we got rid of the sensitive ones very effectively, let the infection be dominated by the resistant ones, and they transmit on brilliantly. Okay, so that's what we mean by this competitive release and what we call this experiment the needle in the haystack. If you want to find these resistant parasites, these rare things that can pop up, hit them hard with the drugs and bang, you'll find them. Otherwise, you don't see them at all. This is actually the World Health Organization recommended guidelines for use of pyrimethamine scaled to mice. So the recommended guidelines do a great job of finding the resistance. And that's why we call it the needle in the haystack experiment, because it really is a great way of finding things. So I put it to you, that's the double-edged sword problem. We've got this issue. If the resistance is there, you will really find it by following these treatment guidelines. If it's not there, you will have a good impact on reducing the number of parasites that are around that can generate these things de novo. So these two opposing forces are there, and we've got this question of how should we treat patients. Well, I think that the aims of the game are to treat patients to make them healthy, to make sure they don't infect other people, and to try to do as much as you can for the onward spread of drug resistance. And in the case of malaria, you want to do that as cheaply as possible. Now, just look at those things. They're actually not rocket science. All of those things are measurable, and you can fiddle them out around with them in the computer and look at what might be going on, but you can also measure those things. You can measure those things in mice and farm animals and people. None of those things is very tricky. So you can actually ask the question, well, in that case, let's try treating patients in different ways and see how we get on with these optimization criteria. I'd love to do that in people, and I think there's probably some scope for doing that in people, given that physicians often disagree on what's best practice, which means there's natural variation in how physicians treat patients. So we should be able to do some of this in a hospital setting, I think. But in a more controlled sort of situation, you can imagine there's different ways of treating patients. You can hit them with a high concentration of drug from day 1 and continue to keep that pressure up for many days. Or you could do a low concentration on day 1 and nothing on day 2 and a low concentration on day 3. Or maybe a high concentration and 3 days off and high concentration. There's lots and lots of different possibilities here. In fact, parameter space is extremely big here on how you might use these drugs. So we've been fiddling around both in silico and in vivo trying to figure out whether there are better ways of treating patients. These are the data I just showed you before. So this is where we put in the 20 or so parasites, find them if we treat them aggressively. And it's really tempting to think that somewhere between no treatment and aggressive treatment, there's some intermediate types of treatment where we might be able to do something that's approaching this and is a long way from this, while at the same time still treating the patient. Obviously, nobody here is talking about not treating the patient. I should say resistance management is really easy. You just have to not use the drugs. Okay, I mean, it's really straightforward to stop resistance evolution if you don't use the drugs. The trick is to whether or not we can use the drugs in some ways that can, in fact, slow the evolution of resistance. And so these are two regimens that we have chosen, not entirely at random. This is 4 mg per kilogram once, 8 milligrams per kilogram once, and then this is the standard practice, 8 milligrams for 7 days. So you can see that what's happening in here are intermediate steps, as you would expect, I think, so that we're getting competitive release, but not nearly as much as we do here. And in terms of the transmission populations, we can really keep them the resistant ones under control with these low dose, what we call light touch regimens. These regimens we arrived at by fiddling around in silico. I don't know if those are the best possible regimens, but the ones we found by fairly arbitrary exploration in the computer, which we thought would generate results like this, and indeed they did. And at the moment I have a postdoc working on the mathematics of this as to whether or not it's possible to prove that there's a perfect way to do it, or in fact whether there's many different ways of doing it, and she's deeply engrossed in the math of that at the moment. But nonetheless, what I put it to you is that there do exist regimens which from a resistance management point of view do a lot better than the recommended guidelines. These populations are overwhelmingly dominated by resistance and at very high levels, whereas these ones are much lower and less frequent and at lower concentrations. So you can actually, with malaria, measure the onward transmission of resistant parasites and any parasites, and this is the probability of infecting a mosquito with resistant parasites following treatment or any parasites, that's the sensitive and the resistant ones. And so this is the aggressive treatment here. This is the WHO guidelines. This is the no treatment case down here. And these are what we call these light touch regimens. That's the 8 mg per kilo, and this is the 4 mg per kilo. And so you can see that from the point of view of onward transmission of resistance to the mosquito, the existing guidelines are really the worst. They do a very, depending on how you want to put that, good job of transmitting the resistance onto the mosquitoes, whereas our light touch regimens, one of them does a little bit and the other one doesn't do anything at all, and is incomparable to not using the drugs at all. And from the point of view of any parasites, so sensitive or resistance, it's still the case that the guidelines are doing the worst job and our intermediate regimens are doing better. But infectiousness is not the only thing. What we really care about here is health. Health is quite a tricky thing to measure, I discovered, much to my surprise. It's a very dynamic thing as part of the problem. This is one measure of health in our mice. So this is the red cell density, the anemia through time. So this is a healthy mouse up here, and then as the malaria spreads through the body and eats up the red cells, they become more and more anemic. The blue line here is what happens if you don't treat the mouse with any drugs at all, and you can see they go lower in the anemia and they take longer to recover. And then these other 3 lines here are when they're drug treated, so drug treatment works, it makes the mice recover the red cell concentrations faster and earlier. And then the dark blue line here is the guidelines, the WHO approach, and that leads to a relapse in anemia, which is due to the resistant parasites resurging. So because of up-selecting those resistant parasites, the mice get anemic again. And then the yellow and the light brown line here, these are our light touch regimens. And those ones do better during this phase, maybe a little bit worse here, but certainly during the main recovery are as good as aggressive treatment. So from the perspective of these criteria for how you should treat patients, the only treatment we have found that is not good in any of those is the recommended guidelines. I emphasize we're not doing random, we're not searching parameter space here randomly. We are picking regimens we think are going to do better than the guidelines, and so far we have found them to always be better at least one of those criteria, and often better at all of them. And I think we are pretty close. So what's the best ones here at the moment in our hands then is just a single day of drugs, and either at full recommended concentrations or half that. I think we're actually pretty close to saying that if our mice could talk, that the best rule would be to take the drugs if you feel sick, stop taking them when you feel better, start taking them if you feel sick again, start again if you feel sick. I think we're pretty close to being able to say that that would be the best thing for our mice. And of course that's the complete opposite of conventional wisdom. In fact, when I talk to some physician audiences, you feel the air being sucked out of the room when I say that. But all I can say is that that's what in our hands with our mice, that's what's going on. And when I get criticised for that, I kind of tempted to say, well, I often do, show me your data. Okay, where you measured health outcomes, infectiousness, resistance spread, those three things. Show me that you're doing better. You need to do health outcomes in a patient, so you need a vertebrate of some sort, and transmission measures. And those are almost always missing from bacterial infections. So I just want to emphasize what I'm saying here, because I know that I have frequently have people misunderstanding the claim here. What I'm saying is that there's a double-edged sword effect, so that if you get rid of all of the parasites, then you get this thing going crazy. What I'm suggesting is that if you get rid of them more slowly, let the immune system do as much as possible of the work for you, those parasites, those existing parasites, will control the resistant ones while you are clearing the entire infection. So we're trying to slow down the clearance process, trying to let the body do as much of the work as possible, and in other words, minimizing the strength of selection for resistance. I put the exclamation mark there to remind myself to say, I still don't know what the best way to treat our mice is. I know better ways of treating them, but I don't know the best way. In terms of the decision you personally might make about how you use drugs as a result of what I've just said, I think this is very much a research area, and I do not have strong recommendations for what decisions individuals should make about how they use their drugs. And you might say that the best thing to do is continue to follow your physician's advice, and that's probably a good idea, but ask her why she's giving you that advice. And really push her on why does she think maximizing the strength of selection for resistance is the best way to control resistance. It's a really interesting discussion you can have with physicians on that. I have actually had colleagues, and my dean had told me last week that he himself only takes the first pill from a antibiotic course now because of my stuff. I really worry about the dean. Yeah. The other thing I just want to say is that there are people who think that this is nuts, and I just want to say that there are other contexts where this has been shown experimentally to be important too. This is a schematic, but it comes from two papers, one from Roy Kishoni's group in Harvard and one from Rob Beardsmore's group at Exeter, where they've been working in vitro with bacteria, where they throw drugs, antibiotics, into chemostats. And in the antibiotic literature, there's a question which is, should you combine drugs which the combination of the two make things even more aggressive, or should you combine drugs which interfere with each other's action, and so that the combination is less aggressive or less effective than the component parts? And that's an interesting literature. So if they're trying to get an infection out, for example, about a hip joint, they're often trying to get the maximum kill rate they can, so they put drugs together that are going to synergize each other's actions to really get into that hip joint and kill things. And Kishoni and Beardsmore have been asking whether that's in fact the most sensible thing to do from an evolution perspective. So they throw the chemicals into chemostats, and what happens is the drugs kill things off very well. If you've got them synergized so the drugs are killing things at a faster rate than the component parts, you get very fast kill rate, but then the bacteria come back very quickly as resistance evolves. If you have them antagonizing, so the drugs antagonizing each other and they're killing more slowly, it takes longer for the resistance to evolve, and so those drugs work better for longer. So the observation is that the stronger you impose the selection in these chemostats, the faster the things bounce back. And that's exactly what I'm saying. Okay, so you can see in chemostats, the quicker you kill the bacteria, the faster they grow resistance back, and the quicker the populations come back. Now in the chemostats, they'll always come back. They're always heading back, because resistance always evolves. If this was a body, one imagines that buying the extra time with the antagonistic combinations give enough for the immune system to kick in and clear the infection. But that's just to show you that there is another context where less aggressive regimens might be the way to go. And also I can't help but mention Bob Gattenby's excellent work in cancer, where he has been arguing that hitting the tumour with full-blown firepower as much as we possibly can to get rid of every single last sensitive cell line as quickly as possible, that also gives maximum advantage for any resistant cell line which can take over. And he's done some extremely nice work in mice showing that you get the best clinical outcomes in the mice, not by trying to kill the tumour off as fast as possible, but by trying to contain the tumour. Just use enough chemotherapeutic agents to stop the thing growing, not trying to kill it off. And that allows the tumour to be dominated by sensitive strains, sensitive cell lines, and keeps the patient alive. So it's not just me saying this stuff. I think there's an argument now, and in agriculture, people appreciate that if you go after pests with huge amounts of insecticide or herbicides against the weeds, resistance evolves very quickly. The more aggressive you do it, the fewer other things you try, the more quickly resistance evolves and the quicker your product fails. So I think there's a whole lot of context now coming together suggesting that using drugs, using chemicals against life forces, living agents that are harming us, using them aggressively is not the most sensible thing to do from the resistance management point of view. And it might be cases where that's true, but it's not going to be generally true. Okay, so then we ask the question, well, can we go a bit further and really ask how should we treat patients? And I want to just give you a flavour of where we're going on this. Don't worry about the equation, I'm not going to go too far on this. This is work we've been doing with Troy Day, trying to work out in principle what matters here, because a lot of things matter. The details are going to matter hugely about what you should do, how you should treat patients. And so that's the sort of thing that calls for an equation, and this is it. So this is the probability of resistance emergence as a function of drug pressure. The first part, this bit, that's Fleming, and the second part is the bit that we've added by doing this ecological approach of asking what happens in a situation where you've got sensitive and resistant cells competing for each other, where you've got a within-host ecology. When you've got ecology going on, what does that do? And that's the second part of that equation. I should say that at least to physicians, it comes as something of a surprise to discover that there could be an equation describing this, and it comes from standard evolutionary biology, where people study adaptation. And some people in the audience will be sick of me hearing say, but it's true, I think, we understand better the evolutionary forces that shape the bill size on Galapagos finches than we do the evolutionary forces in modern American hospitals. Now, not for a second am I suggesting we shouldn't understand the bill sizes in Galapagos finches. That's great stuff. I just think it's embarrassing that we don't have that level of understanding, I don't think for any infection in humans, but certainly not for any of the ones that are killing Americans. Amazing to me. I want to give you a flavour of where this equation side or the theory side of things is going, though. So this is the schematic that emerges from that. I'm not the first to draw this. It's been around for a while. The rate of adaptive evolution is a function of the strength of selection. And here we've got the rate of adaptive evolution being drug resistance. So from a clinical perspective, the faster resistance is evolving, the worse. And if it's not evolving at all, that's good. And then drug pressure along the y-axis. And so the more drug pressure you have, the stronger the strength of selection. So that means that the rate of adaptive evolution is going to increase the more drugs you use. Now, I just showed you data on that. The more aggressively we treat our mice, the faster resistance spreads. That's this side of the curve. And then the other part of it is the more drugs you use, the better you are at killing all the resistant mutants en route. So there's going to be less and less genetic variation on which selection can act. And so that means the rate of resistance is going to slow down. And in the limit, if you can kill everything, even the drug-resistant mutants at some concentration, then you're going to get no drug resistance evolution. So somewhere in the middle is sort of the worst-case scenario where the strength of selection is strong and you're unable to kill all of the resistant mutants, and so it goes nuts. And so the question is, what should we do given this sort of framework? Well, it's really simple. If the upper limit to the drugs you can use, the cost limit or the toxicity limit, is somewhere well to the right of that curve. If you can put drugs into a person at a level which stops any of the mutants surviving, anything happening at all, then it's really simple. Just go for that high dose. And to that extent, Fleming is completely correct. If you use penicillin, use enough. Now, if you can get away with it, is over here, then problem solved. But that's not the issue we have in hospitals. That's not the issue we have in malaria, because we know that you can't get up there. The toxicity issues and the cost issues mean that you can't keep putting up the concentrations before you start to damage the patient. It's the high-level resistant bugs that are the problem. And so high-level ones are the ones that mean that at the upper limit of what you can give a patient, they can still survive. And as soon as you've got those in the system, it becomes much more complicated. The toxicity limit also is going to shift depending on the drug and the bug combination. So in this situation, if this is the limit here, approaching up to the toxicity limit is doing you some good. It's slowing down the rate of evolution. That's good. You want to be over here, but if for clinical need you want to be here, that's good. And as you're coming up towards that limit, it's slowing down the rate of evolution. But if the toxicity limit is over here, then as you're going up to that toxicity limit, it's making things worse and worse. So it really matters where these curves are and what the curves look like. And that's the problem. The curves can be different sorts of shapes, different places. And then the toxicity limit can be in different places. So in this situation here, with this one, well, that's a good thing to go to high concentrations because you get the limit down. Here, you're making things worse and worse as you go up to the limit. Same thing here. Here, it's great. If you can do this one and then get to this limit, it'll really solve the problem. And to me, this is the fundamental issue. We never know where we are in this parameter space. And any new drug-bug combination, we really struggle. We could work this out in our mice, and we could work it out in a chemostat. But broadly speaking, for a new drug-bug combination in people, we don't know where we are here. So we don't know whether we should be approaching that limit or staying well clear of it. And that's a really serious and significant problem. And I guess if I gave you one take-home message here, the take-home message is it's not necessarily a good idea to finish your drug course, but we don't really know what the best idea is. It's a very hard problem. It is not a simple issue at all. And the details are really going to matter, and I think there's going to be no general rule, and that includes the general rule we use at the moment, Fleming's rule, use enough. I think there's no reason to think that's correct across the board. There might well be situations where that matters, but there's no reason at all in theory or in data, I would suggest, to think it's a general rule that's right. The details really do matter. Here's a detail which I really, I think in the malaria case is very clear. Chloroquine, the wonder drug we had at the end of the Second World War, is now useless in most parts of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Chloroquine resistance appeared in the malaria parasites just 5 times. We know that from very excellent molecular evolution work. The parasites that cause chloroquine to fail in Africa, those genes, the resistance genes, those came from a probably mutational event of some sort in 1957, it's been type 2, in Southeast Asia and arrived in Africa sometime in the late 70s. And that particular variants that appeared there as unlinked genes, the particular mutations came together in the right way, got to Africa, and then spread across the entire continent over that time. There's not any evidence whatsoever that chloroquine resistance arose de novo on the African continent. It was a spread process. It had nothing to do with mutations. It was entirely a spreading process. And so what caused chloroquine to fail on the African continent, the timeline it failed on, was not the people who cut the pills in half or didn't take the proper courses or didn't finish their courses. Those people provided weak selection. What drove it across the continent was the people who followed the drug courses, took their drugs, killed off all their sensitive parasites, made sure their resistant parasites had the world to themselves, spread on maximally. So while this disaster was going on, we continued to implore patients, to take drugs in a way which is maximally effective at spreading the resistance. So we continued to treat patients as if mutations were a threat, whereas in fact the door had already opened, the horse had bolted, and we just chased it with a flamethrower. And for me, this is a question about the details mattering. Before the resistance evolved, so in the 1940s and 50s, it was a serious issue, the mutational inputs. But once they're there, once it's rolling, then the mutational inputs are no longer an important part of the process, and you can start to treat managing the strength of selection. And I think TB is now in this case. Multi-drug resistance TB is, if you get multi-drug resistant TB, you got it from somebody else. It doesn't spontaneously arise within you. And so we need to start thinking about where's the risk coming from and treating accordingly. And that the risk is going to vary depending on what it is. I'm not going to go through all these things. Obviously, I'd love to, but there's a lot of biology in here that's going to determine what's going to be important here. And this is a slightly pessimistic note too, because this is going to differ between every bug and drug combination and possibly different types of humans as well. You know, men and women or old folk or young people, whatever. And that's a little bit disappointing because that's going to take a lot of research to work out what is best. It's not going to be any simple cartoon solution you can get out of one equation or one mouse experiment. Okay, so that's part of where we're at. So in other words, that there's nothing straightforward here. We want to think about how we're using our drugs. One of the things that came out of the equations, which was to me a bit unexpected, Troy pointed out that, so this is those mice I showed before, that there's clearly something keeping these resistant guys under control, that we remove that something when we get rid of the sensitive ones. So the sensitive ones are something about them is suppressing the resistant ones. That something would be great to discover, right? If we could use that something to suppress resistance, that would be excellent. And the most obvious thing that's going on here is some sort of what, as an ecologist, I would call competition. There's a negative impact on the growth rate of the resistant ones because the sensitive ones are around, and when you take the sensitive ones around, you competitively release them and they can go nuts. And so that made us start to think, well, if we could identify what they're competing over, and if we could make that competition even tougher, it might be possible for us to use the drugs really aggressively, the conventional drugs. And even though the sensitive ones are being cleared out, if we make the competition really hard, it will be still hard for the resistant ones to emerge. So our notion was that we might be able to evolution-proof a conventional cytotoxic antimalarial drug by resource limitation. We try to intensify that competition that's happening anyway, make it even more intense during drug treatment. We might be able to contain the resistant ones while we treat out the sensitive ones. And that's what we've been doing, and the we here is Nina Wales, a graduate student of mine. She's been doing experiments of the sort I've just talked about. This is in her hands, the standard experiment. We've added the parasites, resistant parasites, in just before drug treatment, and we get rid of the sensitive ones, and up they come. What we've been doing is fiddling with a nutrient that we've been for many years throwing into the water of the mice because it's known to help make the parasites grow better. And that was figured out around about the time I was born, that you add this nutrient called PABA, para-aminobenzoic acid. It helps the parasites grow. The mice don't need it, they get enough from their diet, but there's not enough in the mouse diet that the parasites can access. So if you just throw a bit more into the water, they grow really well. And so we decided, we talked to Nina into doing these experiments where we took the PABA out of the system. And when you take the PABA out of the system, hey presto, you can treat the sensitive parasites out and nothing happens to the resistant ones. So this is exactly the same experimental setup, and all we've done here is take the PABA out of the mouse water. And so the resistant parasites gone in there. We found them in a few mice by PCR, but they never went anywhere. There was no competitive release. We completely contained the resistant parasites, even though we got rid of the sensitive ones, simply by taking away this para-aminobenzoic acid. And it is a competition thing, because if you do that experiment without the sensitive parasites present, then the resistant ones are able to grow up. So they aren't dependent on PABA. They can get away with growing in a PABA-free environment, but not if there are sensitive parasites around. So the competition between the sensitive ones and the resistant ones is intensified in the absence of the PABA and is enough to contain the resistant guys, even though we are clearing out the sensitive parasites with aggressive chemotherapy. And just in case you're getting tense that I've made the mice sick or something, in fact, it's really brilliant because when there's no nutrients in there, the mice, this is anemias again, the mice do really well, whereas when we have the PABA in the system, no nutrients, they get sick again because the resistant ones grow up and cause that relapse. So we are able, by taking away this nutrient, to evolution-proof a conventional malarial drug without doing any damage to the health of the mouse, and in fact greatly improving it because they don't get this relapse. So that's kind of the perfect result, and that's what we want, and that really would be a fantastic thing to make happen in the field. What's exciting about it, to me, is that the sorts of thing one imagines here is that we could get a drug which is resource depleting, so a drug that would take away the PABA. We call it a PABA getter, a PABA grabber. If we could get a PABA grabber, we could use the PABA grabber and the conventional drug together, and that would protect the conventional drug from evolution. The PABA grabber itself wouldn't be detected as an antimalarial drug because those parasites can grow in the presence of without any PABA. So it's not in any sense toxic to the parasites. It wouldn't come up on a regular screen, a PABA grabber, but it does come up when you do it in this competition setting. So that'd be a new way of doing combination therapy. We'd add this extra element in, and it could open up new chemistries. Now, really sadly, we have yet to come across, you can't buy an off-the-shelf PABA grabber. Now, it is possible that we're going to try to build a PABA grabber. But it's not my idea of a good time to go out and try to develop a new drug from de novo. That's not what my lab does, and we might do it yet, but we've got another thought first, which I have to give you, spoiler alert here, doesn't work so far. Well, I remain optimistic, okay? We just need to identify another resource that the parasites are going after that can do this, and we're away, home and hosed. And if we can do it with a drug that already exists and it's approved for human use, it could go into use tomorrow. And the parasite has this great list of, and lots of metabolomics people tell us what the parasites need, great list of things that it needs. One of the most fabulous one is cholesterol. And there's a raft of anti-cholesterol drugs out there on the market now. Some of them are generics and some of them are super cheap. Probably not the ones you guys are using, but there are super cheap anti-cholesterol drugs out there. So we got going with probucol, which is an old anti-cholesterol drug, which for a variety of reasons seemed to us to have the right sort of properties. And Nina, using that on the mice, did manage to get the serum cholesterol down by 75%, but it didn't work. That wasn't enough. So the parasites grew just fine. So, and they grew just as well as if the probucol was there or probucol wasn't, the cholesterol's there or not. So it didn't work. I mean, the optimistic spin of this is it shows that this doesn't have to work. It's an assay which can generate a clear negative result. So we've given up on cholesterol, and we are now working on a variety of things. Right at the moment, we're working on riboflavin. Riboflavin is something which is, there's very good reasons to think riboflavin is a rate-limiting nutrient in the system, and that humans and mice can deal without it for a bit. We're working on that, and that experiment's happening at the moment, where the results aren't in. But after that, we've got a bunch of other things we're looking at as well. I think we're probably going to try 3 or 4 resources that are identified through metabolomics which have good drugs that can reduce them in the bloodstream. And if those don't work, then we're going to go for the PABA grabber. The reason that I think that one of the things about, so we are in this more screening process, the reason I think that this is worth going for in addition to just new types of chemistry involved is there is this very interesting possibility that this is actually different from a regular cytotoxic drug. Parasites have been competing over resources for millennia, and it's possible that they are somewhat maxed out in their evolutionary capacity to get even more efficient at uptake of cholesterol or uptake of PABA, that they are up against the limit anyway. It's possible that's the case. That's a very interesting possibility, that it might actually be that rather than using in combination therapy 2 or 3 brand new cytotoxic drugs that the parasites had never seen before, let's use one of those drugs and let's use these resource depleting drugs, because the resource depleting drugs are not going to be undermined by evolution, because evolution has failed to improve uptake of those things over the millennia anyway. Now that's obviously conjecture, but you can imagine the experiments we could do then. If we can get a PABA grabber, or if the anti-riboflavin drugs work, we can ask, does a combination of pyrimethamine and a PABA grabber, for example, is that more evolutionarily sustainable than a combination of pyrimethamine and sulfadoxine? You can do the experiments and ask, in the laboratory setting, which one fails the fastest in the face of evolution. So it's actually possible to experimentally, I think, work out the sustainability of technologies and compare the sustainability of technologies. And to me, this is a very interesting prospect, that we might be able to use conventional chemotherapy very aggressively in a way that we know is bad, well, I've just shown you is bad for evolution, if we can at the same time intensify the competition between the resistant and sensitive ones, make the most of that. Okay, so where do I want to leave things? Well, first thing is to say that resistance management is a really tricky problem. It's not straightforward at all. I used to think it was a boring problem. It's really hard. I'm really getting thoroughly sick of people telling me what's the truth in this area. I mean, I really and truly, honestly, just give us some data. And I think it's amazing how little data there is about resistance evolution. So there's lots of data on different drug regimens for patient outcomes in the short term in a clinical trial where the drug is being tested for the first time. What we want to know from the point of view of resistance management is when resistance is around, when resistance is in your hospital, what's the best thing to do? When resistance is in the TB in your community, what's the best thing to do? And there you need a readout, which is the evolution. That's to say the rise in the resistance through time. And we really are in a very, very data poor situation. There really is, the knowledge base is extraordinarily thin to me. And I should say this is not just in treatment of human infections, there's also a literature about What's the best dosing to use on fungicides in plants to treat rusts? There's a big argument in the rust literature about this exact same issue from the same point of view. What's more important, mutational inputs into the system or the strength of selection later on? Broadly speaking, if you're going to fight fire with fire, you've really got to know what you're doing. So that's what I mean about being a very risky strategy. If you're going to go full out, you've got to know what you're doing. There might be that light touch regimens do a much better job. I've raised the prospect that we could try to do something with the competition. To me, the issue here is that the within host ecology is really key. You need to look at this problem as an ecological problem, and we really do need a lot more data. Thanks very much.
Hand it to Mark first since he's right here.
Serendipity. It's just fantastic stuff, Andy. I'm really interested in the dynamics of the immune system. So an alternative to the resource-based competition might be that when you have high levels of the non-resistant strain, it's provoking a lot of immune response, which then kill the resistant strain as well. And so if you can figure out that dynamic by
that's
mapping
right.
the antibody titers between the two, you could maybe really fine-tune the system.
That's correct. So when I've talked about resources, one of the things I would include in there is enemy-free space. So that's quite possible that the numerically dominant clone is attracting a very non-specific immune response, which is regulating the resistant one. Yeah, so you might be able to promote that by quite a few different things. In fact, that was why we chose probucol as a cholesterol drug. It also has a very, very interesting inflammatory effects. So it provokes a very interesting inflammatory response, which we thought might help with that side of things. Yeah, no question. We've got a lot to play with here. We could do some immune manipulations. I'd just say one caution here. We don't know what kills malaria parasites. So it's not straightforward measures of antibody titers.
I have a simple question. First of all, in India, all the kids, they never took drugs like what anybody said. We always took a little bit,
Yeah.
then got sick again, took more.
Yes.
So we're already following that regime already, and I think that's why we don't have a bad problem as could have been if we were following everybody who said before. But that's an observation of what happened when I was in India. But from the drug resistant...
Can I just comment on that first? Because the India project we have running,
Sure.
I've observed that. It's very interesting that as things have got better in primary healthcare delivery in India, there's this follow-up. There's a big effort now, which means fewer and fewer people are doing what you said, that people are doing a better and better job at following the guidelines. So the situation might be about to change. The other thing I'd say is falciparum has failed. Falciparum malaria has, chloroquine no longer works in India. But chloroquine works extremely effectively against vivax malaria in India, even though it doesn't work well in Southeast Asia. So something happened in India which meant that vivax malaria did not evolve chloroquine resistance. And it's hugely tempting to think it's the lack of compliance that you're talking about. The kids being bad ended up doing the right thing.
Or the parents only can buy,
Yeah.
very poor, only half the dosage.
And so that's a bit of a disturbing prospect that as countries get wealthier, they might start to use the drugs more and more and lose the drugs. Yeah.
So my brother has a pharmacy, so we see this all the time.
Yeah, right.
What people do. And also we can get drugs without any prescription, so that's the best thing
That's
about
right.
the country.
And so a lot of monotherapy goes on in India as
Yeah,
well.
there's a lot of this thing. But the question was about resistant versus sensitive strains. What's different between them? Genome-wide, or is there anything else that's different? That how do you know what could be driving them potentially?
Yeah, well, so for each of the drugs, the malaria drugs, at least the older ones, we have a very good understanding of the genetic basis of resistance. So in chloroquine, we know the 3 genes involved. For pyrimethamine, the one we've been doing most of the work with, it's a single point mutation in DHFR gene. I guess what you're really meaning is what else is going on in the genomes besides the resistance. And it's true that there are often costs of resistance. And if you continue to evolve those in the lab, at least, they develop compensatory mutations that makes them less and less unfit on their own. In our hands, we can change that just by serial passaging. So there are other things going on there. However, it is always the case in our experiments that even head-to-head, 50-50 at the start, the resistant ones always suffer in competition. I don't know how numerically dominant we'd have to make them win. There will be a point where if you put them in at 99% of them resistant, they probably would suppress the sensitive ones. We've never done that because that's not normally the worry you have in the clinical setting.
My final question is that we did a study on MRSA, and we looked at the vancomycin, the latest drug-resistant strains, and we found that they had a lot of mutations that were actually reverting back to the original sensitive strains. So is there something like that that you've seen in
Yeah, so in our laboratory, we've had no reversions happen, that we haven't really set out to make them happen. But in the field, people have seen it. So for example, chloroquine-resistant parasites in Malawi, chloroquine resistance spread to more or less fixation. They gave up using chloroquine in Malawi, and 10 years later, they couldn't find drug-resistant parasites anymore. So it took 10 years for them to vanish. So in principle, you could use chloroquine again in Malawi. The thinking is that the genes are still out there somewhere, they're just not very detectable. So if you use chloroquine again, they'll come back super fast. But that there seemed to be cost of resistance in the absence of the drug, selection in favour of wild type. That seems to be pretty much a general rule in malaria, and I think in most bacteria as well, not all, but most.
Yeah, Andrew, doesn't the body already naturally use forms of resource depleting drugs, for example, anemia in response to some bacterial infections, and could those sort of natural responses lead you towards the sort of resource depletions you want to impose?
Yeah, I think that's correct. Whether those are adaptations by the body to deliberately withhold those nutrients or that they are just a consequence of the pathogens using them up, that's an interesting question. In our malaria infections, I think the anemias are, in the early part of the infections, totally related to the parasite densities, although it's true that there are fewer red cells than just eaten by parasites. Later on in the infections, when we get very chronic infections, just a few parasites is enough to induce massive anemia. And it's really tempting to think that's the body withholding red cells, trying to starve the parasites out. In terms of developing drugs, so in principle, I think we could contain a lot of this drug resistance if we could make the mice anemic at the point we're drug treating them. But they're already really anemic, and no physician is going to be up for making a patient even more anemic at the point where they might die of anemia. So I think in principle that's right, but I think in practice we need to find a nutrient which doesn't have an impact on host health. PABA is something that you get naturally in a diet if it's got a fair chunk of plant in it. People use it, but we need a lot less of it than the parasite. It's used in DNA synthesis, and the parasites really need it. We don't need it very much. So it's sort of the resource we want. We want a resource where the parasites really need it, and we can do without it for a bit.
What's the mechanism of the drug resistance? Is it efflux pumps?
So the one I showed, so in malaria there's everything. It's beautiful. There's any type of mechanism in principle, malaria parasites will have evolved it. For our parasites of pyrimethamine resistance that I was showing, that's a point mutation in the target site, the drug target site. So it's an enzyme targeted by the drug that's used in DNA synthesis. And it is mutated to an enzyme, the mutated form produces an enzyme which is less efficient, but is not susceptible to the drug. But in chloroquine, for example, it's an efflux pump.
Yeah, so if it is a efflux pump that you're trying to target, you might be able to adapt another strategy that Bob Gatenby has been using of the sort of fake drugs, where you get the resistant cells to use all of their energy pumping out something that isn't actually toxic to the body, but is still activating the efflux pump. So that may be.
Yeah, I think that's also another interesting example of a drug that wouldn't come up in a regular conventional screen. So when you start to rationally think about what sort of things are you trying to get your parasites to do to slow this evolution, you end up with phenotypes, I don't know if phenotype's quite the word there, modes of drug action which wouldn't come up in a routine screen where you're just trying to kill bugs. Yeah.
A follow-up to this question about the possibility of adaptive resource withholding by infected individuals. If you look at that more broadly, I mean, we have, in the animal kingdom, there are a variety of evolved mechanisms for responding to infection, and the immune system being an obvious one. Is there anything we can learn from how that works in terms of perhaps better evidence-based antibiotic applications? Yeah,
I do think there are situations there. For example, in insects, one of the main modes of control of pathogens is through antimicrobial peptides that are produced by the host. And those are actually quite conserved. They don't seem to be under strong coevolution. The same ones now seem to be pretty good 10 years ago. So these are things that work like drugs that don't seem to be suffering from evolution problems. That's an interesting paradox. The answer there seems to be that insects have many antimicrobial peptides, different types that they hit the bugs with. And so it's like combination therapy. So it's evolution proof. So that's an example. I think we're studying the natural history of a situation which to an evolutionary biologist looks paradoxical, the resolution of which teaches you something about how you should better use drugs yourself, formulate drugs yourself. I think there's a lot of that. I think it's also a strong argument for working on things that don't at first face value look very medical. You know, fruit flies can tell us a lot, and that's an interesting possibility, I think.
I'm going to slip in a question, and then we'll have a couple more before break. There are good goodies next door. Andrew, I can sense your frustration. And you know, I wonder if there's a more direct way of confronting this situation with physicians who are making decisions about how to use these drugs and public health authorities who are making decisions. It seems to me there should be some way of really calling the question and having people forced to put their data on the table and seriously consider different public health recommendations. I say this as the person who's been going around saying, there's nothing radical at all about evolutionary medicine. Well, there's not, but sometimes it has quite radical implications that we really need to take seriously, but be cautious about. Where are you at with how we should proceed?
So first let me say that I think that the practicing physician who's making the decisions bedside, they're juggling a lot of things. So you've got to be careful about being too hard on them. They've got a lot of issues going on, particularly in America, where they've got serious litigation issues to worry about. What they're doing when they make a drug use decision is usually following the guidelines that are produced for the hospital or by the professional bodies or whatever. That's where the discussion needs to take place with the people who write those guidelines. And in the malaria case, which is the one I know best, there's a committee of wise men, and I believe it's men, wise men who sit round and every few years rewrite the regulations. And in the WHO guidelines that I showed, they will give a summary of the evidence for each of their recommendations, as whether it's data-based or expert opinion. And in almost all of this, it's expert opinion. So that's an issue where people like me, if we get invited...
With evolutionary biology being missing expertise.
That's right. Now, having said that, if I was suddenly found myself in Geneva and they're saying, how do we use artemisinin, Andrew? I wouldn't know. I would say we need to find out this, and this. But I don't have any better view than expert opinion on artemisinin than anybody else at the moment. It's got to be evidence-based. We are working on artemisinin in the mice. We are working on that. It's got some very interesting properties. It's an instant kill drug. It just goes. It's got no half-life in the bloodstream.
These are the studies, don't you think the Gates Foundation should actually fund?
Yeah.
To really get at the nub of the problem.
And I haven't got no complaints. NIH is funding me. And I honestly, they took it seriously. They gave me money. I don't feel like there's conspiracy here. I'd like a whole bunch more people in the game, and I really like the people who the experts are just to agree that we have a data shortage here. That's the bit that's frustrating to me. Let's admit to our ignorance.
I have two more brief questions and then a break.
You really address a very complex issue that, and I think the answers and the information depend very often on the system you study.
Yeah, no question.
I mean, it turns out that drug resistance in some cases gives an organism a selective advantage over the wild type, such that when you remove the drug resistant bug still rises to the top and is evolutionarily more fit. And this has been shown to be true in Europe when they ceased using certain antimicrobials. And then you've got horizontal gene transfer. And in the microbial world, sometimes the choice of the drug actually enhances the frequency of that. And then you have this point that you make, which is, I think is important, is that, in certain circumstances, the microbe, by persisting, recruits the immune system. Unfortunately, from my perspective, most pathogens are smarter than we are and have worked out ways to subvert, modulate, or evade the immune system so that you don't induce it, so that, they want to set up a situation of persistence. They want to find a warm body and stay there forever. And so it's, I see some of your data, like on the synergistic interactions of drugs, and I did studies, 50 years ago, where I would get data that would disagree with that depending on, which drugs you used and what the mechanisms of resistance were, whether it was multi-step or single step, and whether it was because of an acquired gene or not. So, but it's a horribly complex thing. And there's no question that agriculture and medicine has screwed up the use of drugs ever since they were discovered. And I'm afraid to say, I think they will continue to do so. So I'm anti-drugs.
What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, so your general point that it's a complex problem, that the specifics matter, I totally agree on. And that list of things I put up that I skimmed over really quickly has many of the things you just talked about there. To me, the issue about horizontal gene transfer is a really interesting question. We all probably have a library of resistance genes in our gastrointestinal tract now amongst our commensals, and especially those of you who used antibiotics a lot when you're young, you probably have a lot of them. So that's going to affect the chances that a gastrointestinal bug, at least, will acquire resistance de novo within your body. And so that's going to affect the probability of the resistance inputs coming into the system. Me personally, my personal view is that the less drug we can use, the better. That's at a societal level and as an individual. And that as a default position, you want to have a really special reason to go for an antibiotic. Like, you want to be close to death. And personally, since I got into this, I've given up unless I'm really, really sick. And I think that probably that view is going to become more and more common in humanity as a whole as we learn how important microbiomes are for normal function. You know, if you can change the mate preference of a fruit fly by changing its microbiota, as soon as 21-year-olds learn that it affects their mate choice behaviours, they're going to stop calling for drugs with the slightest sore ear. Or, you know, I think as soon as we really understand what these things are doing, the drug use will go down. So I'm sort of an optimist there. But I very much take your point that, and I want to make it myself, that the details here really matter. There's nothing simple going on here.
Good. Thanks very much, Andrew. Appreciate it.